Evolution involves more than the survival of the fittest. It's also about the survival of the most cooperative, and mutually beneficial relationships are critical to the survival of every species. Welcome to the Symbiotic podcast, where we will explore the collaborative side of life and work to consciously evolve science itself.
Greetings, fellow Homo sapiens. My name is Cole Hans, and I'm the Director of Communications at Penn State's Huck Institutes of the Life Sciences. Today, I'll be talking to two of my colleagues here at Penn State about a unique project that combines their expertise in biology and communications to take on the increasingly important topic of antibiotic resistance. Andrew Reed is Evan Pugh University Professor of Biology and Entomology, Eberly Professor of Biotechnology, and Director of the Huck Institutes of the Life Sciences. His research focuses on the ecology and evolutionary genetics of infectious disease, particularly pathogen evolution-related issues that may harm human health. Erina McGeorge is a professor of communications, arts, and science. She is a social scientist specializing in interpersonal health communication. Her research examines social support and social influence with a particular focus on advice. Welcome, Erina and Andrew. Thanks for joining us today.
Sure.
Thank you.
So in part one of this conversation, we're going to talk about why is antibiotic resistance an important topic for life sciences research. Andrew, would you care to kick us off with that?
Sure. Antibiotics were first discovered and developed in the 30s on, and almost as soon as they were first used in public health, we saw resistance where the bacteria evolves resistance to the drug, so the drug doesn't work anymore. And that's been a continuous problem for all of the 20th century, but it's mostly been offset by the discovery of new antibiotics to replace the ones that have failed in the past. Now that is getting much, much trickier, more expensive, harder to find new drugs. It's increasingly looking like the pot is starting to get awfully empty. And so it's a question of, well, how are we going to continue to get the life-saving advantages of antibiotics without the very use of them causing them to become less effective in time? And these are really critical parts of modern medicine, not just for ear infections or sinus infections or whatever, but also in medicine involving, for example, cancer chemotherapy. People have suppressed immune systems. They're very vulnerable to infections. And so increasingly these drugs are becoming an important part of modern medicine. And it's going to be one of the challenges of 21st century medicine to keep these things going. People die from drug-resistant infections now, and that number is going to rise unless we find other ways of figuring this out beyond just drug discovery.
Thank you. Erina, what do you see as the primary challenge of antibiotic resistance from a communications perspective?
Well, I think there are a couple. One is that I don't think people understand it very well. I don't think a lot of prior research indicates that the general public just doesn't really get the idea that antibiotics will stop working because bacteria have evolved to be essentially immune to them. And then even for a public that understands the phenomenon, they are relatively clueless about the risk involved. They overestimate the utility of antibiotics for a wide variety of illnesses, and they underestimate both the risks of antibiotics in terms of short-term side effects, but the long-term problem of antibiotic resistance. So you have a twofold problem of informing the public and making them aware of the problem, and then convincing them that it's something they should actually be concerned about. And I suppose I should be adding on to that, then convincing them to take appropriate action, which in this case largely means avoiding unnecessary antibiotics.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Andrew, when did you first start diving into this challenge in your career? What did that look like for you?
I guess around the turn of the century, I got interested in using drug resistance actually as a way of experimentally tackling a very different problem. It was a vehicle that we could use to do experiments that would help in this other problem. But after a while, I began to realize that we were actually doing things that were directly informing how one might use the drugs to minimize the emergence of drug resistance. So around 2005, I got more and more interested in the drug resistance problem itself. And then after moving to Penn State in 2007, I guess it was around 2012, that the University Health Service here, the one that provides the health services to the student population, they reached out to us about whether we could do something to help them reduce what they were viewing as unnecessary antibiotic use at that time. So we got into that problem off that basis.
Thank you. So Erina, tell us a little bit about your background before you started working with Andrew on this. I mean, when you approach health communications, what does that mean? What were you looking at, and what did you learn?
I was trained in graduate school in the study of interpersonal communication, and there I focused both on processes of social support, how people try to help each other, and on social influence, how they try to change each other's behavior. And I studied that in my early career principally in personal relationships, so people dealing with everyday problems. But I also began over time to increasingly focus on problems of a health-related nature. So I've done some work on women's health issues like miscarriage and breast cancer, and both influence processes in those contexts and support processes in those contexts. So when I came to Penn State and was introduced by a colleague to the topic of antibiotic resistance, there was a pretty natural leap from the kinds of theoretical and practical issues that I'd been thinking about to this different but still relevant health issue.
Thank you. Very cool. Well, we're just going to take a quick little break and come back with part 2 of our conversation, where we talk about how the two of you got together and what kinds of things you learned from one another as you did this really cool project. So we'll be right back.
At Penn State's Huck Institutes of the Life Sciences, we investigate life from every angle. We study life's forms at multiple scales, from nanoparticles to global biomes, and we confront life's challenges across the globe, from the farm to the city to the wild. Welcome to the Huck Institutes of the Life Sciences, collaborative discovery brought to life.
Okay, welcome back to Symbiotic. In part 2 of this conversation, we're going to be learning a little bit about how a communication professor and an infectious disease researcher end up working together on something like this. So how did the two of you meet? How did you first become aware of one another?
Yeah, so I remember Rachel Smith from my department saying that I needed to come over and meet you, and setting up a meeting and coming over and talking with you in our office, or your office, about the kind of early stages of one of the projects we were thinking about working on.
Yeah, I mean, when the University Health Services reached out to me asking for help on this antibiotic resistance problem as they saw it, within a few conversations with them, it was quite clear that this was a small part life science and a big part communication science. That this was going to be about behavior change, how do people think, and how can we alter their thinking and therefore their behavior. And so Rachel Smith was the only communication scientist I knew at that point, and I reached out to her and this is a problem, and she put us together, and so it went from there.
Right on. And had Rachel been at Penn State a long time?
Yeah, and she'd been interacting with Center for Infectious Disease people in a variety of different contexts, and actually had been housed. Her office was in one of our buildings, and so she was interacting a lot with folk. But the demands on her time were getting bigger and bigger, because so much of what we are trying to achieve when we study infectious diseases is going to involve, or does involve, behavior change, human behavior change. And it's an increasingly big part of what we do.
And Erina, what was your relationship with Rachel Smith at that point?
Yeah, so Rachel Smith was one of my colleagues, and I wanted to point out here that what Rachel did is one of the really key things for interdisciplinary science and tackling major social or health issues, where people who have expertise in one area notice that another person has a different kind of expertise and pull them into the picture. And Rachel essentially said to me, I work on public health in these ways, but you think about public health issues at an interpersonal level. So for you, thinking about how doctors and patients interact around something like antibiotic use is a little bit more natural, and I think you should get involved in thinking about this problem too. And I said, what's antibiotic resistance.
So it's that social network of scientists as people knowing one another and sharing their work that is really critical, I think. It sounds like to be able to put the right team together.
Absolutely, and recognizing that different people have different things they bring to the table.
It's actually quite hard to recognize in disciplines that you don't know much about either. So in my case, communication science all looks kind of the same, much as it, I guess, to you, a microbiology community looks much the same, whereas to me, microbiology communities are made up of lots and lots of subsets of communities and different specialties and so forth. And so it's really important in those early phases to find the right set of expertise, and it's often not that easy to do when you're looking in from the outside. So you need somebody who's got the overview of the area to say, oh, you need to talk to this particular person. And a lot of what we do at Huck is matchmaking in that way, trying to find the right type of expertise for somebody who doesn't exactly know what they're looking for.
So a lot of people will end up playing sort of an ambassador role, more or less.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The matchmaker is very key.
Right on. Thanks. Well, that's what we're all about at the Huck, right?
Exactly.
That's what we're trying to make happen. So once you did start working together, can you tell me sort of the initial stages and how you started to teach one another a little bit about that? Would you like to start, Erina, a little?
Well, I think Andrew and I are actually talking on the way here that in some ways our initial collaboration was stimulated by a third party, by the perceived need at University Health Service to reduce any overprescribing of antibiotics that they were currently engaged in. And there, when we began, or at least when I entered the conversations with them, they wanted essentially to do some self-study. They wanted to look at their prescribing over a period of time and see what the trends were and what the predictors were. And so I agreed to assist with a type of study called a chart review, where we go back through old charts and look, in this case, at bronchitis prescribing and predictors of bronchitis prescribing to try to determine if there were any patterns involved there. And having gotten started on that, we launched into a conversation then about, well, if we're overprescribing, from the provider's perspective, there's the concern that patients really want the antibiotics and they don't have the necessary communication strategies to inform and persuade patients that antibiotics are not actually in their best interest. And I said, well, that's me. That's something I can help you with. And I said, rather than designing an intervention to change what the providers are doing, let's start with a study of what's going on in your clinic right now. So with assistance from the Huck and then from funding from Merck, we were able to launch a study where we sent recorders into medical visits for patients and listened essentially to what doctors and patients were saying to each other about antibiotics.
And then what was your piece?
I would say that the key thing there is that we were brought together around this problem, which we were jointly interested in solving. And so there was different perspectives on how we might solve this. For me, the really important initial issue was that we didn't actually understand in any real depth what the source of the problem was. So we didn't know who was getting antibiotics unnecessarily and who was not. And then we didn't know what was actually going on in these doctor-patient consultations. We've all been to a doctor, we've all had our own, but so we've got our own personal experience, but these are basically anecdotes. You want to know what's the general things that are going on, what's happening most of the time or much of the time. And to me, the idea that the behavioral subtleties that we needed to look at were potentially very significant. That was a bit of an eye-opener to me. The other thing was the physicians involved had very strong views about what was going on. And the subsequent analysis has, I think, not verified a lot of those initial strong views, that very strong experiences stick in people's minds, very impactful events stick in people's minds, but they're not the average practice. They stick in your mind because it was quite shocking that some student sat down and refused to leave the room until they got antibiotics. That's a shocking event if you're a physician, but it's not happening every day. And in fact, it isn't happening in any of the things we've looked at. So it's a rare event, had a big impact on physicians. They don't want it to happen, nor do we, but it's not the main issue. So to me, that quantification of behavior, figuring out what was actually going on, was a really important first step.
Patients do report utilizing a variety of strategies to try to influence the kind of treatment that doctors give. So students will report that they told the doctor about a prior antibiotic prescription, or that they questioned the treatment that was being recommended, things like that. But Andrew's absolutely right. It was kind of striking how little overt arguing was going on in these interactions. And so, one of the things that we can say back to providers is, on the whole, patients are not probably going to come in and confront you and demand things that are not medically appropriate. But that doesn't mean that still also shows us that we need to give providers a way to respond appropriately to more implicit and subtle forms of pressure that patients may try to put on them, because they believe that antibiotics will help them when they won't, and providers need better ways to talk to patients about what will be useful and why antibiotics are not only inappropriate but potentially harmful.
So as you began to collect this data and began to get a clearer picture of what was going on at the Student Health Center here at Penn State, I imagine you began to learn things from one another, right? And so I'm curious to know, Andrew, what kinds of things did you learn through this collaboration with Erina that wouldn't have otherwise come up for you?
I think the biggest message to me is that when you're a scientist, a life scientist, and you think, okay, we just got to sort out the facts, and then you're going to lay the facts down in front of folk, and hey presto, they'll do the thing that's best for them, or that is best for the community. And to me, it's very clear with with our collaboration that is not true, and moreover, that it's not the case that any one person has a good understanding of why people hold beliefs or how to change them. So people have often very strongly held views about what needs to be done, but often those are really, really wrong, even when if it's something we all experience. If we try to teach the students, we're engaged in teaching students continuously. It's what we do in a university. On this particular topic, it's not just putting up a couple of PowerPoint slides and saying, hey, this is what you should do, guys. This is much harder than that. And likewise, the physicians. To me, it was quite a shock to discover that the physicians who are seeing the same patients, same sort of patients, have wildly different prescribing rates. So some physicians will be down at a few percent, others up at 75% for the same clinical presentation. And so to me, it was shocking that there's that much variation in medical practice and medical belief for exactly the same patients. And that was an eye-opener to me. So yeah, and it's at the heart of the problem. If we want to get unnecessary antibiotic usage down, one of the issues is why are some physicians prescribing so much.
Erina, what kinds of aha moments did you have working with Andrew in terms of his expertise and this whole topic?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I was literally introduced to the topic of antibiotic resistance when I came to Penn State. So even for me, there was that learning moment, that because I didn't know that this thing existed and that it was a problem that we needed to address. I think for me, it's just been inspiring to try to work on a public health problem and try to bring communication theory and principles and research methods to this. In terms of aha moments, I work, as I mentioned earlier, in the area of interpersonal advice, and so learning things from this study of doctor-patient interaction about what kinds of things providers should be talking about when they give advice to patients on antibiotic use or non-antibiotic treatments. That's been pretty exciting to see that what providers say during the interactions does influence, for example, whether patients feel capable of monitoring their own symptoms after the visit and kind of knowing what's a real problematic symptom or something that's just going to go away over time, and also how to manage them. So that's been exciting.
Right on. Now, I know that in the past, we have discussed an app that is being developed as well with this. Can you tell me a little bit about that, where that is and what that looks like?
Sure. So just as a little bit of background, the study in which we observed what doctors and patients were talking about in the clinic set up some follow-on efforts to test potential interventions to change provider behavior, to change student behavior around antibiotics. And one of those that we've undertaken this past year is to test the utility of a medication reminder app. Our thinking was that for students who have not lived away from home for very long here at university, the challenge of taking care of themselves can be significant. And that then when a provider says, no, you don't need an antibiotic, what you need to do is take this cough medicine and this decongestant, and you need to drink water, and you need to sleep this many hours.
That's a lot.
It's a lot, right? And
Yeah.
so we thought that perhaps if students had help remembering to do all of the things that will help them feel better while their viral infections, while their body naturally takes care of the viral infection, that they might do better. So we collected data this past year where, it's typical experimental field experimental design where some students were assigned to a condition where they were provided with a medication reminder app, instructed in how to use it, and we assisted them in entering all of the non-antibiotic treatment recommendations that the providers had given to them. And then you have another group who gets normal standard of care treatment and without the app. And we're in the early stages of analyzing the data to see whether the app had an impact on those students' satisfaction with care and subsequent antibiotic seeking behavior, potentially from urgent care or other places here in town.
Yeah, this app I like to think of as MOM. It's a sort of MOM replacement. And it came out of these early analyses of what's going on in these discussions with the patient and the provider. And to me, it is an interesting issue that these students, many of our students in the study were freshmen, so their first year at college, their first time away from the family support, which goes with even the empathy and the make sure you get to bed, all that sort of stuff. And often dorm room life is not consistent with that. So
Yeah.
I like the idea we were randomized to have a electronic mom or not.
Right.
Well, with digital natives, I mean, every generation that comes on, they get something in their hand at a younger and younger age. So it seems to be an app for everything these days. So it'll be very interesting to see when the data comes back if that intervention is effective. It'll be very interesting. Cool. Well,
I should say, perhaps one of the things that's exciting about an intervention like that is it's potentially very scalable. So doing it at a small scale at Penn State campus can easily go to the full Penn State campus, but then the Big Ten and then all student facilities could work like that. So if we could find the magic way that this MOM app would work, then we could roll it out very easily and very cost effectively on a vast scale. So it has big potential impact. Just got to figure out how to make MOM electronic successfully.
Right.
That's right. Very cool. So I'm really curious to know what challenges emerged to your normal way of thinking and working through this collaboration.
I know we had an interesting moment when my graduate students and I were starting to design a brief animated video as an intervention that could be used in the clinic. It could be used pre-visit to sort of clue patients in on the utility and risk associated with antibiotics, a little bit about antibiotic resistance and that sort of thing. And I wanted to be able to emphasize the risk that antibiotics pose to individual patients. And we do know some things about the risk involved. We know that antibiotic-resistant infections are escalating. They are, the CDC figure is 23,000 deaths per year, 2 million extended illnesses. We think that's probably a significant underestimate. But the thing that I went back to Andrew to say was, well, what can I tell individuals about their individual risk? What is their individual susceptibility to an antibiotic-resistant infection? What is the severity of their, potential outcomes from using antibiotics? And Andrew had an interesting response to
Yeah,
that.
so I just assumed that we would have that well under control. That was well known. What Erin is looking for there is the sort of statement we say about smoking, that smoking takes 10 years off your life. So we would like to be able to say something like that. Antibiotic use, when you don't need it, does this.
Right.
And we went looking to you, does this to you. And we went looking for that. And as Erin has said, there's very good data on the number of people dying and sickened by antibiotic-resistant infections. And just to give you some idea of scale, in the US, more people die of drug-resistant infections than die in car crashes each year. And currently the number of deaths is roughly in line with the number of opioid deaths. So the problem is large and growing as these bugs spread. So the question is, how do you relate that population level catastrophe, growing catastrophe, to the individual behavior where you're in the clinician's room and you're making a decision about taking antibiotics or not? And it turned out that, in fact, that was very poorly understood, and that we have lots of qualitative understanding of how this can be risky. It can cause resistant infections in you. You can transmit them to others. Urinary tract infections can be hard to treat. But putting numbers on those things, the equivalent of smoking does this,
right,
antibiotic use now does this, it turned out we don't understand the risks in any quantitative sense. And that's been quite an eye-opener to me. It's a big scientific knowledge gap. We've just written a paper on precisely this knowledge gap, pointing out that actually we don't know this. And if you want to really make an impact here, it's a lot easier if you can say to an individual, you're at tenfold increase of a hard-to-treat urinary tract infection if you take antibiotics unnecessarily now. But we don't know what that number is for this patient population. We do somewhat for pediatrics, for very young children. But beyond that, the individual risk is not well understood, even though that clearly leads to the 70,000 or more dying each year in the US. So the connection between the big population problem and the individual decision is very, very poorly understood. And that's in my wheelhouse. That's not a communication problem. That's but what are the bugs doing?
Right.
It's a microbiology problem.
So the microbiologists have a lot of work to do. There's a lot more to do here.
Much to my surprise, it turns out that the communication people have a lot of good understanding in this space that needs to be applied to this problem. I think we have rather poor understanding of the underlying microbiology and evolution that we can apply to this very dramatic population health problem.
Well, it's heartening to know that folks like yourself are getting together and starting to ask these hard questions and help one another out to frame these questions in useful ways that can have real efficacy in people's lives, right?
Absolutely.
So I'm glad we're starting. You got to start somewhere, and I see you starting, so that's terrific. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with part 3, and we'll look towards the future of next steps in this work and where you want to go with it. And also just talk about what you would tell others who want to get in the game and do this kind of work, not just on this topic, but any big challenge that we're facing. And, we want to promote this transdisciplinary approach, and I'm very interested to know what you would tell others out there. So thanks a lot. We'll be right back in just a little bit.
Are you a science writer enjoying our podcast? We think you might also enjoy Science Writers 2019. This is an annual conference co-sponsored by the National Association of Science Writers and the Council for Advancement of Science Writing. It's coming to Penn State this fall, from October 25th to the 29th. There will be workshops, lab and facility tours, networking opportunities, and plenty of fun things to do. The Symbiotic crew will be there too. We're hosting a panel of outstanding researchers for a live recording of our podcast on Sunday, October 27th, and we're sponsoring a science trivia challenge at a celebration event that evening. For more details or to register, visit sciencewriters2019.org. We hope to see you there.
Welcome back to Symbiotic. I'm Cole Hans from the Huck Institutes of the Life Sciences, here with Erina McGeorge and Andrew Reed. Thanks again for being with us. So in this last part of our conversation, we're going to talk about where you see this research going next and some best practices that you could maybe share with other scientists out there who want to tackle big challenges like this and work together across disciplines. And with that in mind, I would like to know, what were your biggest challenges in terms of working in this transdisciplinary fashion?
Well, for me at least, vocabulary and language. That we often use the same words to mean different things, and Erina's ideas of what constitutes a theory and way she would use a theory are different from the ways we would do that in the life sciences. So I'd say that there was a fair chunk of getting on the same page, and that's a question of sort of ongoing conversation. It also really helped when we got down to writing our first grant together, I think, because you got to put something concrete down there, so you got to actually see the words and agree what you mean. So that process was pretty good in the end, but it definitely took some interactions, and I'm still learning. So there is a whole lot of things that we continue to discuss that. Just explain that. Stop.
Right. Slow down. Can we make sure we're on the same page here? What about you, Erina?
I feel like the challenges we faced were mostly external. I felt like Andrew, as a life science, was very welcoming to a social science, to the social science perspective on this problem, was genuinely interested in what communication science had to offer, and that made it really easy for me to come in and try to provide what assistance that I could. Working with a student population, a patient population in a high volume clinic in the middle of a university campus, and with all of the sort of concerns for patient privacy and for sort of university regulations and policies, we encountered a number of challenges along the way in dealing with all of those things. And I think having that sort of external challenge that we were both focused on, not to mention the challenges of the science itself, at least for me, made it feel like working with Andrew was the least of my problems.
God, yes.
And I have to say that the University Health Sciences people, the folk, especially Michelle Zook and Robin Oliver, really made this project possible, because they were hugely good on opening doors, solving endless day-to-day problems, but also keeping the group's focus on the big picture and their welcoming attitude. When Erina says high volume environment, we're talking 50,000 patients' visits.
Wow.
An academic year.
Yeah.
So
And
it's
state's
very,
big.
very fast moving.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So that third party, and that third party in this case were medical professionals, not researchers. So there are often, with these collaborative efforts, you can have a third party that's even outside the academic field, correct?
Absolutely, and absolutely essential in this case. If you don't have a clinic, you
Right.
can't study doctor-patient interaction. And I mean, I just want to echo what Andrew said about the University Health Services opening doors for us and doing everything they could to make the research possible within the constraints of their number one mission, which is taking care of Penn State students.
Right. Thank you. So what are your future plans for this project? What's next on the agenda?
Well, at my end of things, one of the questions that's really come up is, what are the consequences of taking antibiotics when you don't need them? And so we are starting down the route of trying to measure, with the bugs in the patient's bodies, particularly the ones that come out in the fecal samples, what's happening as a result of the antibiotics. So these microbiome studies are starting now, and we'll be looking at the resistance genes that are rising in frequency in these patients after taking antibiotics, and then how long those resistance genes continue to be shed into the environment. When they're shed, how far are they going? Do they persist? What are the consequences? So there's a whole line of evolutionary microbiology that's been started by this that will definitely continue. But we've also got a whole bunch of other projects that can butt off around this current one. For instance, the students often get flu. We weren't looking at flu, but now we've got researchers interested in looking at what flus are the students getting. And many of these students get flus from farm animals because they're from rural Pennsylvania. Raises questions about what are they getting, what sort of strains, what are they doing, what's happening here. So there's a whole lot of what I would think of as more traditional life science projects that are building off this. But in terms of the sort of question we started with, we're looking for interventions that we can scale across Penn State system and then across the country as a whole, with a view to overall reductions in drug resistance problems in the nation.
Yeah, so I alluded earlier to this video intervention that we were designing. We've done the design, the video has been created, we've done quite a bit of pre-testing, some of that's still going on, and we'll be rolling that into a study in the clinic this fall, so that's coming up relatively soon. Beyond that, we have projects designed and are waiting news of funding that will, on the one hand, target the social networks of students, specifically parents, trying to influence their understanding of antibiotics, because one of the things that we know from our research so far is that students talk with their parents and other social network members, friends, romantic partners, and so forth about their illnesses. And in a striking number of cases, they about 30% report that they get some kind of influence from those people to seek antibiotics.
Yes.
So we need to, if we're going to change student behavior, we also might want to try to reduce the pressure on the students for antibiotic seeking. So we have a number of things lined up to do there.
Also, you mentioned earlier about the doctors, about that incredible wide range of prescribing methodologies for the same exact thing across different practitioners. So it seems like that would beg for some attention too at some point.
So that's the other direction that we're going. So especially from that observational study that I talked about early on, we now know some things about how doctors are trying to explain antibiotics to patients and antibiotic resistance to patients, and have some pretty good ideas about how to improve that. Not that our UHS doctors are doing poorly by any means, but we definitely have some concrete recommendations that we can make for them, as well as how to handle recommendations around treatment and help patients see the value of non-antibiotic treatment. And so another set of projects that we have envisioned is essentially an educational brief video educational interventions targeted at providers, giving them little mini skill trainings that they can listen to 3 or 4 minutes, maybe, here, between visits or something like that, and get a new idea about how to explain antibiotic resistance, or a new idea about how to respond to patients' complaints of how sick they feel. So it's going to hopefully be a little package of skill intervention trainings for providers based on our empirical evidence.
Very interesting.
And if you're asking sort of the longer term picture too, one interesting proposition here is that one of the things that's interesting about students is they go on to be parents within 5 to 10 years, most of them. And most of, a very large chunk of the unnecessary antibiotic use in America is tied up with pediatrics. So the decisions parents make about the antibiotics that their children get really matter in this space. So if there are interventions, things we can do with the students here which play out in the decisions they make for their children in 5 to 10 years' time, that would be very exciting, potentially very impactful. So, funding and so forth allowed, we like to get into studying that medium to long-term impact of interventions that we can make here on campus while the students are a relatively captive audience and very educatable in principle.
Wow, so many different angles to this, so much going on. Let's talk a minute about sort of the more traditional academic, release of new knowledge into the academosphere, as you would. So in terms of conferences, papers, that kind of thing, and sharing this data as you collect all that data that you're still collecting, and we'll be able to share that with the broader academic community. What does that look like?
Well, upcoming, for example, I have abstracts and papers accepted at the International Conference on Communication in Healthcare. It's coming up in October in San Diego. And then the Communication Disciplines National Conference is called National Communication Association Conference, and that will be in Baltimore, Maryland in November. So those are just the first of a series. They've actually had some conference presentations in the last 6 months as well. So.
Great.
Yeah, and we're working on papers together at the moment now. So in terms of meetings that I'm going to be going to, very much hope to go to the ID Week in Washington, D.C. in the fall, which is the big meeting, several thousand infectious disease practitioners and stewards and pharmacists, all of whom are tied up in some aspect of antibiotic use and reduction of unnecessary use. And then the big microbiology meetings, for example, the American Society of Microbiology's meeting in New Orleans in the spring.
That's terrific. Very exciting. We'll see what everybody thinks about this and what other kinds of work it inspires. So I always ask this question on Symbiotic. We're going to be asking this of every one of our guests. How important do you think these sorts of transdisciplinary efforts are to tackle the big, complicated questions that are out there plaguing humanity right now? Like how important are they, and what would you tell others who want to dip their toe into these waters and take on something like this?
I struggle to think of a single problem that's of any major significance to humanity that can be answered by a single discipline. To me, everything, food security, health security, healthcare, cancer, climate change, none of them are going to be solved by a single discipline. The days when you could get a bunch of physicists in a room and come up with a nuclear weapon, those sorts of problems are already handled. They're done. Disciplines work well to solve those. The hard things now require lots of interdiscipline. And almost all of the challenges that face humanity have at the root somewhere human behavior. Changing behavior or understanding behavior is going to be critical to the solution of, I think, every single challenging problem that humanity faces.
That's a good insight. What do you think, Erina?
I think Andrew took the words out of my mouth.
Yeah.
I think it's very exciting as a communication scholar to bring what I know about communication to a major public health issue. And it's brought some new life to my theorizing, to my thinking about communication. I have ended up moving into new domains of research, new terrain, both theoretically and pragmatically. It's been terrific. And I think I would recommend that to essentially anyone. I think working as an academic, I think that interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary research is both essential for our major societal problems and becomes a point of inspiration for individuals working as scientists.
Terrific. And I would like to know from both of you, how welcoming is the world of academia right now in terms of a traditional academic career to this kind of work?
So when I started, when I was first coming out of graduate school, advice to young scholars was essentially to find a theoretical paradigm in which to work and contribute to that and crank out studies and get respect within your own community and publish in your own disciplines. And people who tried to sort of venture out of that and do more applied work or interdisciplinary work were sometimes viewed with awe, sometimes with suspicion. It was a non-traditional kind of thing to do. It was scary because it wasn't well supported. You would get awkward questions about, well, why are you publishing in that journal? Those kinds of things. I think we're close to the tipping point where scholars, social scientists who do not have a connection to major public problems are going to be seen as having the inadequate research profiles. But that's been over the course of over the last 20 years. So I think there are still challenges. We still, as scholars, sit within departments and disciplines, and we have things like tenure homes, and so there's still tension sometimes between the kind of work that your people expect and the kind of work that you might be inclined to produce because of your engagement with a specific public problem, but the awareness of the need for those things to come together has, grown immensely, and I think increasingly we're going to see people who tackle theoretical problems in major public spaces and whose work in major public spaces informs their theory in a more, shall we say, symbiotic kind of way.
That's what we're shooting for. That's right.
Yeah, from my perspective in the life sciences, I think that there's still a very strong pressure while people are on the tenure track process, that first 7 or so years in their academic careers, to make sure they're publishing very good articles in their specialist areas. And that probably is not going to go away. that pressure. But there are more and more young people who are managing to do that as well as publishing in transdisciplinary areas. And I sense a very strong hunger from many of them to have impact beyond their ivory tower specialties. And after that tenure step has happened, then a lot of people start thinking, well, how are we going to make impact? How am I going to do something that's going to make a difference that I'll be remembered for? And that very quickly, for many people, leads to transdisciplinary things, problems that are bigger than the individual lab. Not always, and there's not one size fits all here. And some people are always going to be, an inch wide and a mile deep. But and we do need such folk. But the portfolio of academia is getting broader, and there are more and more people who are handling these sort of transdisciplinary problems now and comfortable with doing that than perhaps any time in academic history of academia, many thousands of years.
So, based on what you've learned through this collaboration together, what kind of advice would you give to other researchers who want to, use best practices in making something like this work?
Well, the lessons I've drawn from the experience we've had so far is that we came together around a very tangible problem, well-specified problem. How do you reduce unnecessary antibiotic use in the student health clinic? It's a very well-defined problem, and that gets us talking. And then we needed repeated conversations. So in particular, the antibiotic stewardship group at the UHS would meet sort of monthly, and so we'd be having these conversations, repeated conversations while we're getting on the same page. And I think that's a lot to be said for proximity in that sense. It's not easy to do these things remotely or by email. There needs to be conversation while you're getting the language sorted out, while you're getting to figure out what the main issues are. Now I think we could probably function on Skype or something pretty easily, but back then it was really important that we were seeing each other regularly and developing things. I think having some tangible, early, well-defined problems that we could get a head around. Erina mentioned earlier the chart review project we did. That was a tangible exercise where it was quite clear what we should do and why we should do it. And so working through those problems, when we got to know each other better, we had this defined goal, this defined deliverable. So I'm big on these sort of baby steps that are well-defined. When you've got this longer-term goal, but you've got something to handle, in year one. I think that was actually really critically important. We've also been on the receiving end of some very broad-minded financial support for getting this, initially from the Huck Institute and subsequently from the Merck Investigator Studies Program. And that's been a really critical part. Those funders could see the need for this and that we had complementary skills that could allow this work to grow. So sort of nurturing funding in the early phase has been an important part of that too. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I would just maybe echo that, patience is required to cultivate relationships, to learn how other people think. Risk-taking is something that I've seen as a necessary component. I'm sort of risk-averse by nature, but to move projects forward, especially interdisciplinary projects, sometimes you have to sort of put crazy ideas, or not so much crazy, but be willing to try to do things you really haven't done before, think about things in different ways. I've moved out into the area, really seriously out into the area of health campaigns rather than being specifically always focused on doctor-patient interaction, thinking about how you deliver messaging to patients or parents or things like that. And then just perseverance. There are going to be challenges, things are going to happen, and you're going to have to find your way over roadblocks or around them. And as a somewhat more junior scholar to Andrew at this point, I've really benefited from his mentorship. Watching him figure out how to knock roadblocks down is something I've really appreciated over time.
Good skill.
And perhaps I could add too. I think the other thing is you need a lot of mutual respect and open-mindedness about somebody else's discipline. And so for us, I think that's been kind of good because neither of us have expertise to judge the other. It's like you just assume you know what's going on in your area. And the same with the physicians. They know what they're doing clinically and medically, and we don't. So we're not trying to second-guess them. We're going with whatever and early on, that's hugely useful. Now I think we have enough expertise to look at each other's stuff and say, yeah, that was pretty cool, or that's not so good. But early on, you have that mutual respect and complementary skill set, which allows the whole thing to move forward without anybody feeling that they aren't bringing something to the table or they're being overshadowed. And I think that's really important in the early stages.
Right, that human dimension.
I think it's increasingly clear that for academics, research academics, they need a balanced portfolio of risk. You need some safe bread and butter stuff that's going to make sure everything keeps going, and we should do that. We need to do that. You need to have some stuff which is varying degrees of crazy, and that shouldn't be really all crazy, and that should be, some stuff that's semi-crazy and some stuff that's, really crazy. And then how you balance that time-wise is really a question of individual comfort. And I do know people that are throwing everything into what I think is a totally crazy idea. And, good luck to them, but that's not me. But having, 1 day a week on something that might turn out to be a dud doesn't seem too bad to me. So I think it's really a question of balancing this risk portfolio. And that's, of course, true for, businesses, entrepreneurs, insurance companies. Balancing risk is what it's all about.
Right. Even communication.
Even communications folk.
Taking a risk right here. See if people are interested in learning about symbiosis and how researchers can be symbiotic with one another.
Exactly.
Well, I thank you again for this wonderful conversation. I wish you the best of luck moving forward and hope to see you soon.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.